Where are you on the spectrum of hope for the role of automation in trucking?
I think automation is inevitable. And again, I think this is really going to be transformative. And it's going to be, I've studied the history of trucking technology as much as I can. There's not a lot of great stuff written, and you kind of have to, there isn't a lot of data and places to know sort of volumes of stuff and how they're changing, et cetera. But the big revolutionary changes in trucking are because of constellations of factors. It's not just one thing, right? So Daimler builds, a motorized truck in, I think it's 1896, right? Intercity trucking. So basically what they use that truck for is just to swap out horses, right? And they basically do the same thing. The service doesn't really change, and then World War I really spurs the development of sort of bigger, larger trucks, like spreads, air-filled tires. And then we start paving roads, right? And paved roads, right? Air-filled tires and the internal combustion engine. Now you got a winning mix. Now, it met with demand for people who wanted to get out from under the thumb of the railroads, right? So there was all of this pent-up demand to get cheaper freight from the countryside into cities and between cities that typically had to go by rail. And so now, 40 years after that internal combustion engine, it becomes this absolutely essential, right? This necessary but not sufficient piece of technology to create the modern trucking industry in the 1930s. And I think self-driving trucks are going to be part of that. And the idea, I guess we credit Jeff Bezos. The idea is, okay, so Sam Walton, if we can do it like a slight tangent on sort of the importance of trucking to business strategy and sort of how it has transformed our world. The central insight that Sam Walton had that made him the giant that he was in influencing the way that so many people get stuff was a trucking insight. And so if you look at the way that he developed his system, you build a distribution center and then you ring it with stores. Those stores are never further out from that distribution center than a human-driven truck can drive back and forth in one day. And so rather than the way all of his competitors were doing it with sending trucks all over the place and having people sleep overnight and sort of making the trucking service fit where they had stores, he designed the layout of the stores, right, to fit what trucks could do. Mm-hmm. And so transportation and logistics, right, become Walmart's, edge, right, and allows them to dominate the space. That's the challenge that Amazon has now. They've mastered the digital part of it, right? And now they got to figure out, like, how do we, dominate the actual physical movement that complements that. Others are obviously going to follow. But the capabilities of these trucks is completely different than the capability of a human-driven truck. So if you're Smith Packing, right, and you've got, a bunch of meat in a warehouse and it's going to grocery distribution centers, you have that trucker probably come in the night before and you make him wait so that he has, a full 10-hour break, which is what the law requires, so that he can get to the furthest reaches that he can of one of those stores, mm-hmm. right? So he can drive his full 11 hours and bring that meat so it doesn't have to sit overnight in that refrigerated trailer, right? And so their system is based on that. Now, what happens when that truck can now travel 2 times as far, right? 3 times as far? Now you don't need the warehouses where they were. Now you can go super lean with your inventory. Instead of having meat here, meat there, you can put it all right here. And if it's cheap enough, substitute those transportation costs for all that warehousing costs, right? So this is going to remake landscapes in the same way that big box supply chains did, right? And then, of course, the further complement of that is, how do you then get it to people at their door, right? And, the big box supply chain, it moves very few items in really large quantities to very few locations, mm-hmm. pretty slowly. right? E-commerce aspires, to do something completely different, right? Move huge varieties of things in small quantities virtually everywhere as fast as possible, right? And so that is like that intercity trucking under the, in the era of railroad monopolies, right? The demand for that is potentially enormous, right? And that, so there's so right now I think a lot of the business plans for sort of automated trucks, right? And sort of the way that the journalistic accounts portray it is like, okay, if we swap out a human for a computer, what are the labor costs per mile? And like, oh, here's the profitability of self-driving trucks. Like, this is transformative technology. We're going to change the way we get stuff.
So we could actually get a lot more trucks, period, with autonomous trucks, because they would enable a very different kind of transportation networks, you think?
Yeah, and this is where it's like, like, yeah, so we really thought we were going to be electrifying trucks. If they're going twice as far, if they're moving 3 times as much, if they're going 3 times as far, right? What does that mean for how far we are behind on batteries, right? We've got sort of these, ideas about like, man, we, here's how close we could get to meet this demand. That demand is going to radically change, right? These trucks are, so then we've got to think about, all right, if it's not batteries, how are we powering these things? And how many of them are there going to be? Like right now, we've got 5 million containers that move from LA and Long Beach to Chicago on rail. Rail is 3 or 4 times at least more efficient than trucks in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And on that lane, it varies a lot depending on demand, but maybe rail has a 20% advantage in cost, maybe 25%, but it's a couple days slower. So now you cut the cost of that truck transportation per mile by 30%. Now it's cheaper than rail, and it gets the stuff there 5 days faster than rail. How many millions of containers are going to leave LA and Long Beach on self-driving trucks and go to Chicago?
And it might look very much like a train if we go with the platooning solution, where you have just these rows of imagine rows of 10, dozens of trucks or hundreds of trucks, some absurd situation, just going from LA to Chicago. Yeah. Just this train, but taking up a highway. This is probably a good place to talk about various scenarios.
Well, before we get there, can I just make one interesting observation that I made as a driver? Yeah. When you're in a truck, you're up higher, so you can see further and you can see the traffic patterns, and cars move in packs. I'm sure there's academic research on this, right? But they move in packs. They kind of bunch up behind a slower car, and then a bunch of them break free. And this is sort of on almost free-flowing highways. They kind of move in packs, and you can kind of see them in the truck. So, rather than platoons, we might have hives, of trucks, right? So you have 20 trucks moving in some coordinated fashion, right? And then maybe the self-driving cars are, because people don't like to be around them or whatever it is, right? You might have a pod of, 20 self-driving cars sort of moving in a packet behind them,
This is what, if the aliens came down or were just observing cars, which is one of the sort of prevalent characteristics of human civilization, is there seems to be these cars moving around that would do this kind of analysis of what's the interesting clustering of situations here, especially with autonomous vehicles. I like this.